That was my number one.
Oh, that was your number one. Oh,
that was me
so
going
close.
off on my number one. But my runner-up, I have a runner-up.
Really fast, before runner-ups, I do my number one.
Yeah, you do.
This is the most overlap I think we've had. My number one is the invasion of Ukraine. Just so many people have died or had their lives actually destroyed, been carted off to Russia. The huge amount of war crimes, the completely unacceptable nature of it from the very beginning, the fact that it's revealed so much about how the right wing views Russia and Vladimir Putin and war and all that. I mean, there is so much about this story, and it's still an ongoing situation, but obviously it's impacted so many people's lives. So that's my number one thing, although everything on this list has been really big. Less so the Elon Musk, I don't care as much about that.
Check it out.
But yeah, Roe v. Wade, the midterms invasion, so significant.
1, 2, 3.
So what was your runner-ups?
Oh, I wanted to say about the Ukraine invasion too, like.
Test. Test. Check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Check. Test. Here we go. Test. 1, 2, 3. Pronunciation. Test. 1, 2, 3. Pronunciation. Check. Test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Check. Test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. Check. Testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Check. Testing. Check. Testing.
2020, the insurrection was like the tail end of 2020. We all know that.
We're gonna have to, at some point, we're gonna do top 10 years from the point of view of politics.
Oh my God, we're so old.
We are. Top 100 years. Anyway, we're not there yet. Anyway, that's our top 10 list. I'm sure there's stuff we missed. And I'm sure a lot of people would fill their list up with more, like stuff that was happening in pop culture or music or good stuff, personal stuff too. Anyway, you have a chance to do that in the comment section down below, as well as suggesting top 10 lists that you'd like to see us address in the future. Thank you for now to everyone for supporting the channel and the network and making this extra content possible. Thank you to Francesca for joining me as always.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, and we'll see you soon. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we have a new revelation from the January 6th committee transcripts that may implicate Jared Kushner now. I'll put the transcript right here on the screen from Alyssa Farah Griffin that says, quote, "It was the first COVID-like morning meeting that Jared Kushner led after that had been announced, and Dr. Birx raised, she said, well, should we be looping in the Biden transition into these conversations? And Jared just said, absolutely not, and then we just moved on." So given what we know about the dangers of COVID, does Kushner have any legal exposure here?
He does, and I'm glad we're getting to revisit the topic of criminal liability for how the Trump administration badly mismanaged, and that's putting it mildly, because I think much of their misconduct was intentional, not just negligent, but why they really do bear criminal responsibility for avoidable COVID deaths. So now we have this new revelation in this transcript where Dr. Birx had wanted to include the Biden administration in COVID briefings during the transition period, right? She wanted to make sure that there was a safe, smooth, informed transition. And Jared Kushner said, absolutely not. He disrupted that safe, smooth, informed transition. Now, does this surprise us? No, because if you'll recall the reporting, that Jared Kushner was quoted as saying, look, at the moment, COVID is impacting, it's affecting blue states more than red states. So let's just let it run rampant through the states. Brian, I have maintained all along, and I've talked about this a number of times, that the way the Trump administration handled the pandemic really does give them criminal liability. Why do I say that? So for 22 of my 30 years as a prosecutor, I was handling murder cases in Washington, D.C. I was trying them. I was supervising them. I was responsible for overseeing all murder cases in the courts of D.C. while I was a federal prosecutor. And, you know, if you look at the law of homicide, let's just take the law of D.C. as an example. Each jurisdiction, each state, and the District of Columbia has its own laws on the books, and it defines homicides and the different levels of homicides in slightly different ways. But I think we all kind of are familiar with first-degree premeditated murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. Some jurisdictions have what we call negligent homicide. I'm going to use the laws of D.C. for this discussion about the liability of the Trump administration. So there's a relatively low level of homicide called involuntary manslaughter. And there are three elements. That is, if somebody does three things, these three elements, then they are criminally responsible for involuntary manslaughter, for death of another. Let's talk about those three elements, and then let's talk about why Trump and Kushner, and I want to talk for a minute about Mike Pence, who was the head of the coronavirus task force, while Trump and Kushner were creating circumstances that allowed for avoidable COVID deaths. So I think Pence has responsibility too. Let's talk about those three elements. First element is somebody acted in a grossly negligent manner. What does that mean? They did something that was just kind of reckless. It was really negligent. And there are actually two ways that you can fulfill this first element. I hate to make this a Crim Law 101 class, but bear with me for a minute. Somebody either acts in a grossly negligent way, or they have a duty to act like they're the president of the United States, and they have a duty to faithfully execute the laws of the country. They have a duty to support and defend the Constitution, and they have a duty to protect the American people. They have a duty to act, and they fail to act, and that failure is grossly negligent. I maintain Donald Trump actually satisfies element number one in both ways, because he acted in a grossly negligent way, and he had a duty to act, and he failed to act in a grossly negligent way. Anyway, that's a mouthful, but that's element number one. Element number two is that the person's negligence put people in harm's way. More precisely, the person's gross negligence was reasonably likely to result in death or serious bodily injury to another. And then the third element is that the person's negligence or their failure to act caused the death of another. And that's where a lot of people back up and they say, well, you can't really prove that Donald Trump caused the death of another. And that sounds good on the surface, but when you scratch below the surface and you look at how the law defines causation, Causation simply means that your grossly negligent conduct or your failure to act was a substantial factor in bringing about the death of another. Not that you killed them, not that you shot them or stabbed them or strangled them, but that your conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the death. Now, let's apply these elements to the known conduct of Donald Trump and by extension, Kushner and also Mike Pence. First of all, did Donald Trump act in a grossly negligent way? Did he put people in harm's way? Well, let's see. He lied to the American people about the dangers of the pandemic, right? He has now admitted to Bob Woodward in private interviews that I always wanted to downplay it. He didn't want to tell people the full truth. He didn't want to give them the tools that they could then use to protect themselves. He said, it's going to go away like a miracle. The warm weather will kill it. You have nothing to worry about. And here is one of the things that he did that I think best exemplifies how it is he was grossly negligent. Remember, there was a White House press conference, and terrific reporter Jeff Mason was asking Donald Trump a question, and he was wearing a mask. Why? He wanted to protect himself. The CDC was recommending wearing masks to protect yourself and others to, deter transmission of this deadly virus. And what did the president say to Jeff Mason? I can't hear you. Take off the mask. Jeff Mason said, no, Mr. President, I'm protecting myself and others. He said, oh, I see. You want to be politically correct. Think about it, Brian. What message did his base take away from that? That you are worthy of being mocked by the president of the United States if you wear a mask to protect yourself and others. And here's the thing. Americans should be able to rely on what the president is saying and doing and make their life decisions accordingly. So he was grossly negligent. Did his gross negligence result in, was it reasonably likely to put people in harm's way? It absolutely was, because he was contradicting the very guidance that we all knew would protect the lives of Americans, would slow or prevent the transmission of this deadly pandemic. So the first two elements, check and check. Let's go to the third element. Did Donald Trump's negligence cause the death of others? I have a concrete example that I like to use to illustrate why the answer to that question is yes, Donald Trump committed the crime of involuntary manslaughter because he checks all three boxes. So when I was chief of homicide in D.C., we had a case where a robber was chasing a victim down the street. The victim was trying to evade the robber, and he ran between two parked cars. He darted out into the street. He was struck by a vehicle, and he was killed. Now, did the robber kill him? Did the robber cause his death? Well, not literally. The driver of the vehicle caused his death. But this highlights how the law looks at causation. Causation is a substantial factor in bringing about the death. And the robber chasing the victim into traffic was a substantial factor in bringing about his death. I know I've gone through a whole Crim Law 101 class on the law of involuntary manslaughter. Thank you for bearing with me. But this is why I absolutely believe, as a former career homicide prosecutor, that Donald Trump is criminally responsible for avoidable COVID deaths.
So let me follow that up with this. We've seen how difficult it was to even start an investigation for something as egregious as an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. So given that, what's the likelihood that we'll see prosecution for something that's murkier like this?
The likelihood is low. And I say that only because I am looking at what appears to be an absence of prosecutorial appetite to take on these avoidable COVID deaths, which I think is inexcusable. Believe me, I have talked to my prosecutor friends across the country, because there were avoidable COVID deaths that occurred in every single state in the union. So I think every local prosecutor would have a reason to at least investigate the possibility of criminal liability for Trump, for Kushner, for Pence. And yet we certainly haven't seen any charges. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, other than This would be a very forward-leaning investigation and prosecution if it were brought. And Brian, you and I have talked about the fact that no prosecutor seems to be determined or seems to have the appetite to be the first one to indict a former president for his crimes. I have maintained all along that once that dam breaks and we have one brave, strong, determined prosecutor indicting Donald Trump, all of the others will follow.
I would offer too that a big part of why we're not seeing any movement in the judicial space when it comes to COVID is because there was so much mismanagement in the beginning, but because this entire thing was politicized by the right while we were in the midst of COVID, and because masks became an issue of politicization, because vaccines became an issue of politicization, basically now you have half of the country on that team. And so it makes it so much more difficult because any prosecution, even in the realm of avoidable deaths, is going to be criticized by half of the country. By half.
I must have this propensity to just...
I was very much struck by how the
You're watching the legal breakdown. You're watching the legal.
in Dublin, and he's going to play us.
So, fashion models walk through the art galleries wearing chic dresses in the same prints that are framed to hang on the walls like old masters. And what's more, this art is washable.